Hello and welcome to my channel, I Win to Lose Gaming. In today's Ultimate Guide video, you'll learn everything you need to know about Zibai. Okay, we've got a lot to cover, so no time to horse around, let's get right down to business. This video was filmed on the early access server and is not indicative of the final product. There may be some changes on release, so be sure to check the comments down below to see if there are any. As always though, we'll go through her kit, artifacts and stats, weapons, constellations and investment priority, teams, and finally, my opinion at the end of the video. And with all that stuff out of the way, let's finally actually take a look at her kit. And we will today be visiting our Pyro Registrying friend. So here we go, we'll just knock it down. And we can see her basic attacks are doing physical damage, her charged attack as well, which is interesting for a sword user. The two hits actually come out basically at the same time, which is pretty interesting. But as expected, her basic attacks are doing negligible damage. But before galloping on over to the rest of her kit, you guys need to understand what the heck is Lunar-Crystallize. When certain nod-krai characters are on the team, when Hydro and Geo meet, Hydro-Crystallize gets evicted, or the much more violent Lunar-Crystallize italicized text with gradient filling. Lunar-Crystallize creates 3 Moondrifts, and when you trigger 3 Lunar-Crystallizes, the Moondrifts will fire 3 homing attacks that deal Lunar-Crystallize type damage. Interestingly, there's not much of a cooldown to how frequently these can fire, so you can see a pretty absurd amount of Lunar-Crystallizes in certain situations. But wait, that's not all. Not only do you get all this free damage, these Moondrifts even count as Geo-constructs. Lunar-Crystallize's damage is calculated very similarly to Lunar Charge, where everyone who contributes to the reaction also contributes to the damage, with the character who deals the highest damage contributing all their damage, the character who deals the second highest contributing half their damage, and the third and fourth characters contributing 1/12 of their damage. Similar to other transformative reactions, Lunar-Crystallize scales off of character level, elemental mastery, and enemy resistance. But what makes Lunar-Crystallize special is that it can crit. And all that only explains the Lunar-Crystallize reaction. What about Lunar-Crystallize direct damage? As an example, Columbina can deal direct Lunar-Crystallize damage with her gravity interference attack. Lunar-Crystallize, like the other direct lunar damage types, does not scale off of elemental damage or bonus damage. And also similarly to Lunar Charged, instead of the hidden 3x multiplier that Lunar Charged has, Lunar-Crystallize has a hidden 1.6x multiplier. But of course, Zibai's kit revolves around her elemental skill, where when you use it, her basics are now infused with Geo, and this cannot be overwritten either. And as you can see on the last hit of her basic attack string right there, she does an extra instance of Lunar-Crystallize damage. And as we can see, these basics are based on her elemental skill, and they scale entirely off of her defense stat. And we can see here that her basics are actually dealing a non-negligible amount of damage. I mean, look at the Registrying taking some big chunky numbers here. Well, I guess some small chunky numbers. But we can see that the Registrying has already lost about 2/3 of its health or so just from her basics while in her elemental skill form. And I'm sure you guys already noticed, but when she uses her elemental skill, she gains this phase shift radiance bar. I believe that's what it's called, but I'll just be calling it horsepower. And at 70 out of 100 horsepower, she can use her elemental skill in order to cast this horse yeeting attack. And yeah, it looks very cool. So let's go ahead and throw a horse at our Registrying friend really quick. So there we go. We're going to knock it down. We're going to use our skill. And then bam, just like this, we're going to throw this horse at it. And just like that, the Registrying is taken out in just the 1970s Toyota Corolla's worth of horsepower. In order for Zibai to spam her high horsepower elemental skill, Zibai needs to generate horsepower. She generates 10 horsepower per second passively. She generates 5 horsepower from her normal attacks with a 0.5 second cooldown, and she generates 35 horsepower once every 4 seconds when the Lunar-Crystallize reaction occurs with Ascendant Gleam. And this 4-second cooldown is reset when she uses her Horsey elemental skill. So yeah, as you can see, you'll want to spam basic attacks and activate Lunar-Crystallize in order to quickly fill up her horsepower. Another unique property of her elemental skill is that while it has a 15-second duration, her skill ends early once you use 4 high horsepowers. This may sound like a bad thing, but in reality, you can use this to your advantage to shorten her field time. And let's quickly navigate through some additional properties of her elemental skill. You can't swap off of her skill or else she'll lose it. And she also generates a geoparticle with some sort of cooldown on her basic attacks. I'd estimate that she generates around 4 to 5 geoparticles per rotation, although as usual, more testing needs to be done with particle generation. And the final piece of the puzzle for her kit is her elemental burst Tri-Sphere Eminence. Her elemental burst is quite simple, as the first hit just does some raw geo damage, and the second hit deals a very solid amount of Lunar-Crystallize damage. It also extends her burst's duration by 1.7 seconds, and let's also quickly gallop through her passives, with this one adding plus 60% flat damage scaling off her defense to her Horse Yeets, which ends up being a very small buff to her Horse Yeets. The next passive has her gain 15% defense per Geo teammate and 80 elemental mastery per Hydro teammate. While not massive buffs like what Skirk gets, these are very nice benefits and incentivizes you, but doesn't force you, to run fellow Hydro and Geo teammates. And do nod-krai because she also has the standard 5-star nod-krai passive, where she changes Hydro-Crystallize to Lunar-Crystallize, and she also gives up to 14% multiplier to Lunar-Crystallize, capping at 2000 defense. And of course, she provides +1 moon sign level as well, pretty standard stuff. Her last passive is a neat little quality of life feature where she gains energy passively at nighttime in the overworld. This of course doesn't work in domains or the endgame content like Abyss or Stygian Onslaught. Phew! Now with nothing else left to cover in her kit, let's trot into her full kit in action. Frankly, I was really impressed by this, with Zibai being able to rein in a Simon in just a single rotation with minimal help. Also, you may have noticed, but Zibai has a decent amount of combo potential, and with this string that I found, I've managed to shorten her skill duration time to about 10.5 seconds, although she does need a bit of extra time to swap off, but anyway, I'm sure there's room for further optimization. But yeah, in typical Hoyoverse fashion, she's yet another character who's simple to pick up and play, with a decent amount of nuance to optimize. Now, here's another combo that you can do with Zibai, although I don't have any footage of it, although DHCWSP does on his channel, so feel free to go check him out. But basically, what you can do is you can extend Zibai's field time with a couple additional N4s in order to output a couple more instances of Lunar-Crystallize damage. This is particularly useful if you want to, for example, dispense a couple more of Illuga's quills or eat Lua's quills, thanks to the additional N4 activations. For Zibai's talent priority, you'll definitely want to prioritize her skill first, followed by her elemental burst. After that, you don't have to level her basics, but I guess you can if you want to. We've naded to Zibai's build section, and fortunately we can say Zibai-bye to excessively long guide videos, because she is actually quite simple to build in comparison to, well, I guess Columbina. Fortunately, we only really have one artifact set to consider for Zibai, that being the 4-piece Night of the Skies Unveiling, which of course provides 80 elemental mastery for the 2-piece set bonus, and 30% crit rate if you have Ascendant Gleam, which you should definitely have for Zibai's teams, as well as 10% more lunar reaction damage for her. So obviously this set is incredible for her, and overall it is her best in slot option. And another really neat part about this set is that because it provides a ton of crit rate, well, Zibai, fortunately, her ascension stat is crit damage, meaning that it won't be too easy to overcrit Zibai in comparison to some other characters, especially once you factor in the weapon choice. So yeah, an amazing set for Zibai, all things considered. Now, there are a couple other combinations you can mention, I guess I will mention, with one of them being the 4-piece Husk of Opulent Dreams. Assuming, full uptime, it still performs a lot worse, 10% worse than the 4-piece Night of the Skies Unveiling. And we have 2-piece combinations. I just recommend going for the 4-piece Night of the Skies Unveiling because it is definitely by far her best option. Next, we can talk about the main stats. And this is, I guess, slightly more interesting, but it's pretty much for most people just run a defense % timepiece, defense % goblet, and a crit circlet, either crit rate or crit damage. Typically speaking, with crit damage weapons, to balance the 1-to-2 crit ratio, crit rate circlet tends to be a bit better, and for crit rate weapons, you want a crit damage circlet. It's a tale as old as time. Then we have other options like Elemental Mastery Timepiece or Elemental Mastery Goblet, but they're pretty much just always a downgrade, which is why I don't recommend them. So definitely go for a defense % timepiece, defense % goblet if you can, but you can use an Elemental Mastery one if you have a really good one. Up next, we have Zibai's substats, and it is also as expected. Crit rolls for her are definitely the best option overall. However, defense % rolls are actually not far behind for her. Well, they will get a bit more diluted if you have Gorou or Illuga on the team. These calculations don't have Gorou or Illuga on the team. I want to keep this just pretty neutral, focusing on just Zibai's damage because a lot of people are going to have a lot of different team variations. But yeah, so just remember defense % will get a bit diluted depending on her teammates. As usual, go for as many crit roll substats as you can. Preferably you get double crit plus defense % on your artifacts. And heck, even better is if you can get Elemental Mastery as a 4th substat or a 3rd one depending on your main stat. As well, if possible. And finally, flat defense technically isn't useless on her. Now, I wanted to very briefly talk about what about energy recharge as a stat on Zibai. And unfortunately, if you want to reliably, fairly consistently, and there's even some caveats to that, burst every rotation, even in poor particle situations, you actually need around 130 to 140% energy recharge, depending on the characters on her team. And there's multiple layers of RNG to that too. But let's say that you do go for the burst every single rotation and you want to guarantee that. Well, you're going to be looking at about 138% energy recharge in comparison to a 0% energy recharge build where you burst every other rotation, squeezing in that additional burst every rotation at the cost of a ton of other crit and defense % substat rolls will overall lead to less damage. But of course, if you can get the energy recharge, great. And there are certain fights which you will be able to more consistently get her burst every single rotation, even with lower energy recharge requirements. So treat it as more of a bonus stat and not really a stat to necessarily hit a breakpoint for, because obviously Zibai, while her burst is good and you should use it every rotation that you have it, it is not absolutely mandatory because you can always replace the time that her burst took with an extra N4, which of course deals a bit of lunar charge damage plus some non-negligible geo damage, and it is not worth sacrificing offensive stats in most situations to get her burst up consistently. Next, we have Zibai's weapons, and I realize I spent way too much time yapping about these, when honestly her weapon choices are pretty limited and pretty simple. And the reason why it's so simple is because Zibai is a purely defense scaling character. So that means that there are a lot of weapons that are just completely irrelevant for her. And with that being said, unsurprisingly, the Light-Bearing Moonshard, her signature weapon, is definitely her best option, providing a ton of crit damage for the substat, as well as some defense %, and finally a ton of Lunar-Crystallize damage as well. And it is about 28.3% better than her best free-to-play friendly option, the Harbinger of Dawn. And the next best option for her is Chiori's signature weapon, the Uraku Misigiri. This thing is also pretty solid, providing a ton of crit damage and also some defense %, as well as some basic attack and elemental skill damage, which Zibai technically deals a non-negligible amount of. Then we have the Light of Foliar Incision, which is also a pretty good 5-star stat stick for Zibai. Then we have the Harbinger of Dawn, which is overall my most recommended free-to-play friendly option. but with some caveats. You do need a team that can help keep her HP over 90%. Up next, for a more consistent free-to-play option, we have the Flute of Ezpitzal, particularly in teams where you cannot consistently keep her HP over 90%. The Flute of Ezpitzal might be more preferred. Then we have some other 5-star stat sticks under the Flute of Ezpitzal, although these ones might be a little bit better depending on if you run Illuga and Gorou, but their performance is pretty close. But if you have these, you can consider using them. So you can run the Splendor of Tranquil Waters if you're in a SIG. You run the Primordial Jade Cutter. Just keep in mind, Primordial Jade Cutter, you're very likely to over crit. And finally, we have an honorable mention or a shout out to the Cinnabar Spindle. But overall, anything under, I would say right here with these weapons are just not weapons that I recommend for Zibai. Up next, for those of you big horse industrial complex tycoons out there who turn horses into glue, we have Zibai's Constellations and Investment Priority. And as we can see, both her signature weapon as well as her constellation provide very significant gains to her, with her signature weapon providing about 28% increase to her damage output, and her Constellation 1, which allows her to use 5 horses, with the first horse also being an extra big horse, providing a very solid roughly 24% increase to her damage output. What this means is that both of these have fairly similar value overall, and because of Zibai's banner and the way it is, I overall recommend pulling for her Constellation 1 before going for her signature weapon, because you're very likely going to get Illuga, dupes, and constellations. Her Constellation 2 is also very solid, providing 30% Lunar-Crystallize reaction for the entire team, as well as much bigger horses. Well, I guess not like much bigger, but just a bit bigger horses. And this 550%, or I think it's 550% off the top of my head, might look extra insane, but it is kind of deceptive. It is similar to her passive, which is just flat damage, and it literally only multiplies with her crit stat. At least through my testing, doesn't multiply with the Lunar-Crystallize multiplier, or for example, even the resistance stat. I could be a bit wrong about this, but that was just through my own personal testing. But because of that, don't be tricked by this and think, oh, she's going to be doing like 4 times the amount of damage. No, okay? It's flat damage, and it's a weird flat damage at that, but still, these are going to be bigger horses. Constellation 3 adds 3 levels to her skill, making it a very solid Constellation 3. Constellation 4 is a bit iffy, and I'm not 100% sure about my calculations for this one, because I didn't really get the chance to really optimize the combos, but you should be able to get different combo strings out of this and likely squeeze out 1 additional, maybe 2 additional N4s, most likely about 1 additional N4, and the N4s deal more damage. So it's a pretty decent constellation if you are able to squeeze out those additional N4s. Then we have her Constellation 5, which gives 3 levels to her elemental burst. Overall, her burst is good, but you know, it's a pretty small portion of her damage output, all things considered. And Constellation 6 is of course incredibly powerful, providing up to about 48% elevated multiplier to her horses, give or take a few percentage points depending on how much horsepower she has. And this is of course just an estimate, because there's going to be some weird min-maxing to be done with this. However, we can expect a big damage increase. And finally, we have C6R5, which deals about 3x the damage of a C0R1 Zibai. Pretty typical stuff for modern DPS characters. Now, the next question is, should you use Masterless Stella Fortunas on Zibai? And Zibai is a pretty solid candidate for this, being a main DPS character, as well as being a character that fully scales off of the defense stat, because this will increase her base defense stat, which of course improves her damage. On top of that, the Lunar-Crystallize reaction will also gain some increased damage thanks to her level going up. So overall, Zibai is a good character to use your Masterless Stella Fortunas on. We've made it to the team section for Zibai, and since this was filmed after the creator experience went Zibai, well, we're going to have a stand-in for Zibai, and personally, they look the same to me. It's a little hard for me to tell the difference between Zibai and this character here. There are a few main team building principles for Zibai that you definitely want to keep in mind. The first most important principle is to make sure you have Ascendant Gleam active on your team. There we go, we fixed that. Zibai, of course, is a moon sign character, but we have this horse who is not an ascendant horse. but you need to have at least 2 moon sign characters on the team in order to activate Ascendant Gleam. This is very important for Zibai in order for her to speed up her combos and to output 4 horses during a rotation. The next recommended aspect of Zibai's team is to have Geo Resonance active, which means having 2 or more Geo characters on the team. Having 2 Geo characters will provide this 15% bonus damage, which isn't too impactful. However, it will also provide 20% Geo Resistance Shred, and considering Zibai's passive, which also gives 15% defense for Geo characters in her party, having that second Geo character is extremely recommended. Now, the next criteria for a Zibai team is to always have a persistent Hydro applicator that can apply enough Hydro for Zibai to activate Lunar-Crystallize throughout her rotation. And the next team building criteria is hopefully you can squeeze in a non-moon sign character, like for example Gorou. Gorou is a character who can provide the non-moon sign character buff right here. This part isn't absolutely as necessary as the previous requirements, but just know that, for example, these characters will also provide a decent percentage of lunar crystallize damage or lunar damage to the team based on one of these stats. Now, the last tip that I have is to avoid Dendro as well as Cryo characters. These characters will completely remove Hydro auras, which makes it very, very difficult to properly activate Lunar Crystallize. So that's kind of the final requirement for her teams, is to avoid Dendro and Cryo. Now, with all that being said, let's talk about the Geo characters that you have as options. And while I don't have Illuga here on my regular account, we can pretend that he's here and I can of course still talk about him. Illuga is still a very solid character at Constellation 0 for Zibai, boosting her damage significantly, somewhere around 20 to 30-ish% for Zibai's damage output. Constellation 4 Illuga will also further improve this, and Constellation 6 Illuga will increase Zibai's damage by roughly the most out of most of the support characters in the game, by roughly 52-ish%. Now, I got this question about Illuga a lot, but are his constellations necessary to use him with Zibai? And the answer to that is definitely not. But his constellations, especially his Constellation 6, do make a big impact. Now, the next character who also happens to be on Zibai's banner is Gorou. And Gorou is another very solid teammate with Zibai, providing very significant buffs, especially at Constellation 6, and even providing a little bit of healing with his Constellation 4. Now, the next character we have to consider is Zhongli. And Zhongli, with the Favonius, as well as in fights where his pillars don't get instantly deleted, is actually a pretty decent option, able to provide some geoparticles as well as a very thick shield. You could build him for a thick shield build, or you can build him for the instructors to provide a bigger damage gain. And of course, he provides the 20% geo resistance shred as well as hydro resistance shred. Another pretty solid character is Xilonen, but Xilonen, especially at Constellation 0, needs to have 2 other Petch characters on the team, so something like Columbina plus a Nepha or Columbina plus another Hydro will work well for this slot. For Xilonen, she can also provide healing through her Elemental Burst, which is actually something that Zibai teams tend to often lack a significant amount of. So Xilonen is actually a very solid character, and she can also equip the 4-piece instructor set without losing much utility otherwise. Unfortunately, Constellation 2's plus 50% geo damage isn't very helpful, but the Geo Source Sampler will always be active with Constellation 2, which means that you can run triple Geo if you have Constellation 2 Xilonen. Another decent Geo character to utilize with Zibai is Chiori. And Chiori actually benefits at Constellation 0 from Lunar Crystallize, because Lunar Crystallize counts as a construct, so you can get both Tomato and Tomato out on the field, even without her Constellation 1. Chiori, of course, also deals a non-negligible amount of damage, especially with, for example, some buffs from a character like Gorou. And finally, we also have Albedo, who can be run with another Hexarai character like, for example, Fischl or Mona, to provide some non-negligible buffs to Zibai. Albedo, of course, provides a decent chunk of Elemental Mastery, is a great user of the Instructor set as well, and Fischl, for example, can utilize the Elegy for the end, along with providing 160 or 180, I forget, 160 I think, Elemental Mastery to the entire team. So this team actually surprised me with how effective it was. Now, there might be some finicky bits in terms of activating Lunar Crystallize, which may need additional testing. From my initial testing, this team worked fine. Now let's talk about the Hydro slot options. And generally, the characters that I personally recommend are obviously Columbina being the best one by far, with Aino being a decent one, although of course she has her issues with Circle Impact, providing a much less significant buff than Columbina does, and basically not doing damage, but of course she also fulfills the Ascendant Gleam requirement for Zibai. After that, we have some options, like for example Xilonen, who also happens to have an 18-second cooldown on her Elemental Burst. And you don't have these Circle Impact issues. Xilonen can also use the Elegy for the End as well. Now we have Zibai, who is a pretty solid healer and can also equip the Elegy for the End. However, keep in mind that when it comes to Zibai, she does not really apply enough Hydro for Zibai, at least not on her own. So a second Hydro character like for example Columbina or Xilonen, who can solo apply enough Hydro, are definitely the way to go. Another decent complementary Hydro character is Kokomi. Another one can be Nilo, especially with Constellation 1 to extend her ring's duration. And with the Key of Kajni Sut, she can definitely provide some non-negligible buffs. Then we have Mona, who in my opinion needs to be the second Hydro character if you do use her, with for example Albedo for the Hexarai buffs. Me personally though, I'm not the biggest fan of Mona for this role. And finally, we have Furina, who I personally didn't like too much, but I'm sure a lot of people will like using Furina for Zibai. You can pair Furina with, for example, Xilonen if you need to, for some healing. So for example, a team like this can work as well. One nice thing about Furina being on this team, she reduces the energy requirements of Columbina, allowing Columbina to be built for more damage as well. So what about some non-Hydro, non-Geo options? Overall, the best one immediately that comes out is Anefa. Anefa just can't win Anefa, so she is going to be another fantastic teammate for Zibai, is that she provides a pretty thick shield overall, all things considered, buffs Elemental Mastery, and of course deals a ton of Lunar Charge damage for the team. So a very solid character, all things considered. But my personal favorite option is going to be Instructor's Xilonen, as she will buff everyone's damage on this specific team. This team is also fantastic for the Harbinger of Dawn. Speaking of the Harbinger of Dawn, you want teams with a Harbinger of Dawn that can provide healing, for example, who can provide shielding, for example, and who can provide some minor healing like the prototype Amber from Columbina. And if you can't fulfill, a couple more characters kind of worth mentioning are Sucrose, who provides a decent chunk of Elemental Mastery, as well as Jehoda, especially if you don't mind taking some field time for Constellation 6, and if you find ways to shorten Zibai's rotation time, it can be worth running Constellation 6 Jehoda as well, but generally speaking, I personally recommend sticking to some of the aforementioned team archetypes. So what do I think about Zibai? Frankly, she's an amazing Lunar-Crystallize DPS character, and her banner is a whole team for her. If you skipped on Flynn's or Nefer, Zibai is an incredible pickup. Yes, even if you have Columbina and Anefa, Zibai frankly feels amazing with them as well. I will say that Zibai does not work well with Lauma though, so do keep that in mind. Now unfortunately, when it comes to the Lunar DPS meta, in terms of really long-term account investments, like let's say a year from now, it's hard for me to recommend having two main Lunar DPS characters, like for example Flynn plus Zibai. Because Lunar Shield will end one day, and when that happens, your Zibai and Flynn's won't be nearly as useful as they are now, where we might have multiple Abyss sides and Stygians shilling Lunar at the same time. So do keep that in mind. Not only that, but you only have one Columbina, and while Zibai is still pretty solid without Columbina, Columbina is simply heads and shoulders over the other Hydro competition. There's also one more detail about Zibai I forgot to mention. Her basic attacks do feel very stubby, so you might find yourself dashing a lot to get into range to smack things, even more so than many other melee characters. Overall though, Zibai feels fantastic to use, and I doubt most of you will have regrets pulling for her. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Win to Lose, signing out.